In this module, we will look at several business frameworks. These business frameworks will help us understand the business and set the context for the information technology or the computing components within a business. The learning outcomes from this lecture are as follows. How does the structure of the industry segment of an enterprise determine what the enterprise's business strategy must be? 2. Of all the different things it might do in order to improve its competitive position, how can an enterprise decide what specifically to do? 3. How may an enterprise translate its strategy into actual plans and actions? 4. Once an enterprise knows what it must do, how can information technology, that is, computing, help in its actions? 5. How must IT work so things are done in the right way for the business? So now to the first learning outcome, how industry structure affects an enterprise's strategy. Porter's 5 forces or 5 elements of industry structure consist of the bargaining power of suppliers, the bargaining power of customers, the threat of new entrants or new businesses into that industry structure, and the threat of substitute products. And finally, these 4 elements play into the 5th element, which is the competitive rivalry within an industry. Now, keep in mind that these 5 forces are not independent. So the 4 elements certainly play into the competitive rivalry, but there's also intersection or interaction between the other 4. The first 2 forces, namely buyer and supplier bargaining power, are opposites of each other. Anything that increases buyer power reduces supplier power, and vice versa. Also, the main principle that affects these 2 forces is the law of supply and demand. Anything that increases supply relative to demand will increase buyer power and reduce supplier power. Anything that increases demand with respect to supply will reduce buyer power and increase supplier power. The next force, the third force, the threat of new entrants, is essentially determined by the cost of entry into a market relative to the potential benefit of entry into the same market. The fourth force, the threat of substitutes, is determined by how well the existing products in the market satisfy and have a hold over the customer. The strength of the last force, that is the intensity of the competitive rivalry, is determined mostly by how much each enterprise has to lose by losing the competition and how much to gain by winning the competition. The notes pages on the slide provide more refined examples of how the 5 forces may be affected. So please take a look at these notes pages. Once a company understands its competitive position, it will try to improve it. So how does it figure out what to do? In order to figure out how a firm may improve its competitive position, we have to study its value chain, which represents the operations of the firm. That is, the value chain tells us what the firm actually does. So what is the value chain? The value chain is a representation or a framework that is really part of the same 5 forces model, Porter's 5 forces model, of the internals of a particular company. The value chain is broken up into 2 sets of activities. One set is known as the primary activities, and the second set is known as the support activities. So the primary activities are the activities that an organization does that are directly related to the creation and selling of its product. So the first primary activity is inbound logistics, which is how does the company acquire the raw materials in order to make its product. The second primary activity is the operation. So a manufacturing company it would be the manufacturing operations. For a consulting company, it would be the consulting services, how it delivers those consulting services. For a software company, the operations are how it makes the software. The third component of its primary activities, or rather the third primary activity, is what is known as outbound logistics, which is a really big word or really big phrase for how it delivers its products or services to its customers. So, for example, the outbound logistics for a farm would be how it gets its produce or its livestock to the market. So it would include things like transportation and so on. The fourth primary activity is marketing and sales, how it sells its product. And the fifth primary activity is service. So once the product has been sold, how does it service the product? Now, these primary activities are supported by secondary activities. So, for example, procurement activities, which are how does it select the raw materials to buy, how it sets up relationships with its suppliers. That's procurement, and that's a secondary activity. In other words, it's not directly related to the making and selling of its product. Similarly, technology, including information technology, is a secondary activity within a company. So, for example, for a car manufacturer like Ford or Toyota, the information technology is not directly related to the manufacturing of its cars. Actually, it is, and we'll come to that later. But because there's information technology embedded within a car, so it's part of the raw materials that go into a car. But if you just think of the systems, the enterprise systems that support Toyota or Ford, they are support systems. They are not really there to manufacture the product. The human resource management, the HR organization, is a support activity. The part of the organization that hires and fires its labor does not directly go into manufacturing the product. So that's a support activity. And finally, the firm infrastructure, like the factory space, like the floor space, like the electricity that comes in, the electrical wires that come in, all those things, that's just firm infrastructure, and maintaining that, creating that, supporting that, that's all a secondary activity. In this slide, we have started detailing the value chain for a computer manufacturer like Dell. Can you fill out the details? What raw materials need to be brought in by inbound logistics? How are these materials procured from the manufacturers of these raw materials? How is a PC made? How is it sold? What R&D goes on? What IT systems and other technology may support the company? So now let's think about how firms actually compete now that you've been able to understand and analyze industry structure and the competitive position within a firm. Basically, the goal for a firm is always to create a sustainable, defensible position within the market. Sustainable means something that can keep going. Defensible means something that can't be attacked by others. And typically firms follow what are known as generic strategies. And the three generic strategies are cost, differentiation, or focus. So the generic strategy of cost is simply low cost. Okay, so one firm decides that it's going to compete by being the lowest cost provider within an industry structure, and that's how it chooses to compete. The second way that a firm might compete is through differentiation, which is to say that it positions its products also within an industry structure as somehow being different from somebody else's product. And if it is able to successfully do that, then it would be able to successfully compete. So, for example, in the fast food industry, fast food organizations spend a lot of time and effort differentiating their products from the other fast food companies. And the only way they can really do that, other than through the two ways they can do that is through recipes and so on, and then also through advertising. And then finally, the third way a company can compete is through what is called focus. So rather than trying to compete over the entire market, hope that makes sense. Rather than trying to compete over the entire market, a company will define a focus within that market that it will choose to compete in. Basically, it is reducing the area or the battlefield in which it competes. So it says, it decides, I won't compete for cost for the entire market or the entire human population. I'll compete based on lowest cost, and my market is going to be teenagers. So for all the things that teenagers buy, I'll be the lowest cost provider. Yeah? So for example, let's take a shoe manufacturer. Rather than competing over all shoes, it competes over athletic shoes that young people typically buy. Okay, um, and it can choose to either compete on cost within that smaller market segment, or it can choose to differentiate itself within that market segment. Okay? Essentially, it has chosen to redefine the market in some manner. The other thing is that in order to, focus might also be to focus on a area of weakness within its competitors. So, for example, it could decide that it can position itself as the highest quality supplier within a particular market because it knows that um, quality is firstly something that is highly regarded within that market, and secondly, it knows through internal information or how these other companies make their products that these other companies cannot really compete with it on quality. Okay, so it's basically targeting a weakness in some weakness within the businesses within a market segment, and deciding to focus on that. So these are three generic strategies, and then ultimately, once a firm has defined a strategy in which to compete, using which to compete, so whether it might be cost or differentiation or focus, what a company will do is then tailor its value chain in order to compete in the way it has chosen to compete. So if a company chooses to compete on cost, then it will try to take all the cost out of its value chain. Okay. If a company chooses to compete on differentiation, then it'll tailor some component of its value chain so that it can provide the differentiation. By the way, what might provide differentiation? Presumably there is a design component to its value chain. A company might choose to focus on its design competency so that it can provide a differentiated product to its sellers. What might be a design competency for a fast food restaurant? It might be its recipe generation. So it might put in a huge amount of investment into, oh, I don't know, people who can come up with new recipes. Okay, hope that makes sense. Finally, a closing point for this slide. Keep in mind that while firms want to compete, very few firms want to compete in a manner that damages or blows up the industry structure. Companies essentially want to survive, but they don't want to kill everybody else off. Okay, nor do they want to change their market structure so that all of a sudden they can't make money there. So, for example, if you think about the auto industry as a whole has chosen not to provide high fuel economy vehicles. Okay, even though according to some sources, the technology to provide highly fuel efficient vehicles exist, vehicles that can get 100 to 200 miles per gallon. No auto company has chosen to create such an automobile. Okay, for the longest time, the American auto companies had chosen not to provide automobiles of extreme quality, automobiles that could last 15 or 20 years. Because think about it, if they did offer such a product, then people would buy an automobile only every 15 or 20 years, and that would completely destroy their industry structure and their ability to stay profitable. So the point really that is being made here is that firms, of course, want to compete, but they don't want to damage their livelihood or damage their industry structure by their competition. So now let's go back to our point about how firms compete. They compete, or they achieve competitive advantage by optimizing the value chain once they have decided upon their strategy. So in a sense, the value chain reflects the industry structure and shapes the industry structure. So when you look at the value chain of different organizations within an industry structure, you'll find that that they're often quite similar. They have to purchase the same raw materials in order to create the same products. And but that internally, and by the way, so they purchase the same raw materials to create the same products, typically in the same ways. They might sell in similar manner and so on. If you think about it and take a look at the fast food industry, Burger King, McDonald's, Wendy's, Arby's, they all sort of sell the same way. They sell similar products. They source from the same suppliers, things like that. So the value chain essentially reflects the industry structure. However, internally, depending upon how a firm would want to compete, it shapes the organizational structure. So what I mean by that is, there are all these different components within the value chain, that each component doing a different thing within the value chain. The connections between these components, or whether particular components are merged or separate, will depend upon how the firm will want to compete. So that Apple competes on product design. So, it should be no surprise to you that Apple's product design group, the group that designs the aesthetics and the look and feel of its products, is tightly integrated with the engineering design group, the group that designs the computing part of the Apple computer. Okay, primarily because they want these two groups to sort of work together, so closely work together, they're part of the same group, because Apple differentiates itself on its product design. Basically, the point I'm making is that each activity in the value chain is a point of differentiation. And companies, in order to achieve competitive advantage, will look at each of these activities, yeah, and optimize these activities. In addition, rather than just simply looking at individual activities, they look at the linkages between these activities. Because if you think about it, what is done in one activity, the output of one activity flows in or becomes the input of another activity. So when you source raw materials, those raw materials become the input to the operation or the manufacturing process. And how closely these activities are connected is determined by how a firm chooses to compete. So once again, back to design and manufacturing. For Apple, the linkage between design and manufacturing is likely to be tight. Whereas for some company that just manufactures a standard PC, the linkage between design and manufacturing is not likely to be tight. Similarly, for a fast food restaurant, the linkage between product development or new recipe development and marketing is likely to be extremely tight, because as soon as it comes up with a new product, it would want to create a tailored marketing campaign for that new product. So just keep in mind that when a value chain is optimized, you're optimizing not only a particular activity, but also trying to optimize the linkages across activities. The next point I want to make is that scope affects the value chain. So the other thing you can optimize about your value chain, or rather really about your organization, is where you choose to compete. Do you choose to compete across the entire industry segment? Do you choose to compete within a particular geography within an industry segment? Do you choose to compete within a market segment within that overall industry segment? So do you want to compete over, say, teenagers or the elderly or working professionals? How you carve your market out is segment scope. Where you compete in terms of locality is geographic scope. What industry you identify yourself with is industry scope. And how integrated your value chain activities are is integration scope. Are you integrated all the way from developing the new materials, the raw materials, to selling it? So for example, if you are a grocery store, do you start with the farming of your produce all the way through to the selling of the produce? That the level of integration is also a scope that the company can determine. So just to summarize, the value chain shapes and reflects industry structure. It shapes the organizational structure. In order to optimize the value chain, you want to optimize the activities themselves and also the linkages within the activities. And the scope in which you compete both determines your value chain and is determined by how you want your value chain to be. Okay? And I want you now to think about how information technology can help optimize the value chain. Two references have been provided for this portion of the lecture and uploaded to the course site. Please make sure you look at both, and in particular the presentation by Ratan D'Souza, member of the strategy team at Worthington Industries. Now that the enterprise has a strategy, one of cost, differentiation, or focus, and it knows what elements of its value chain to address, how does it translate its plan into execution? Let's take a breath and recap here what we have covered so far. We know that strategy has to be based on an organization and its environment. And we can analyze this using Porter's 5 forces. We know that once we have created a strategy, we have to translate the strategy into operational terms and then document and communicate this plan so that it can be executed jointly by everyone in the organization. And actually there is more. This execution, this operationalization of the strategy has to be measured and used to continuously improve the strategy, the plan, and the execution. These items, 2 through 5, are addressed by the balanced scorecard. So now, what is the balanced scorecard as opposed to what it is used for? The balanced scorecard consists of 4 components: a learning and growth component, an internal business process component, a customer component, and the financial component. So the idea is something like this. Let's say you have to improve something, a component within your value chain, some activity within your value chain. Well, you have to train your people or give them new knowledge in order to improve that component. Then with that new knowledge, they can modify how they work within that component, or they can modify the internal business processes within that component. Okay? When they modify those internal business processes, hopefully they get improvement in what they do. That makes for a better product, that makes the customer happier, and that improves or results in additional sales or more profit. Okay? Hope that makes sense. So basically, you train the folks, you give them new knowledge, you train them to do their jobs better, they end up doing their jobs better, therefore they end up making a better product, therefore they end up in selling more, and therefore they end up in making more money. Yeah? Something like that. Hope that makes sense. This slide is an example of a balanced scorecard. The objectives column shows what is to be achieved in each of the 4 components of the scorecard. The diagram in the column to the left of objectives shows how these goals are linked. The initiatives column, all the way to the right, details what actions are going to be taken. The measures column explains how the results of these initiatives or actions will be measured, while the targets column lists what the desired level of improvement or achievement are for each of the objectives. This HBR paper by Kaplan and Norton is a useful reference on the balanced scorecard. Having explained how businesses seek to gain competitive advantage, we will now look at how IT can help in the process. So here's how to think about information technology and competitive advantage. Basically, the ability of IT or computing to provide competitive advantage depends on what is known as the information intensity of products of the firm's products and of the firm's industry structure. So if a product has high information intensity, IT can provide great value. If the industry structure has high information intensity, then IT can provide competitive advantage. So how do you think about this? How does one think about this? Basically, each step in the value chain has a physical component and an information component. Okay? IT can optimize the performance of the step by making the information component of the step better. Okay? For example, IT can optimize the performance of a step by capturing knowledge of how to do it right so that people do it better by following the appropriate instructions. IT can make the step operate better by automating the step. IT can exploit information in order to help the person executing the step do better. So it's not just a set of instructions on the step itself, but IT or computing can provide information to a user, feedback to the user that will help the user in doing that step better. And then the another example of where IT can help is by building reconfigurable systems. So in many cases, um, having an information technology component can make the integration of two steps easier. Next, IT can help exploit linkages between components in the value chain better. So it can provide coordination among the linkages. It can provide information across linkages. It can help reduce documentation costs and so on. Next, a company's information is also its product. So for example, LexisNexis, credit reporting agencies, companies that provide product, service, and support, their primary product is actually information. Next, IT can change the industry structure. So for example, through the use of IT and automation, IT can change the cost structure of firms. So all of a sudden, a firm has a significantly lower cost in producing some kind of product, and thereby it has a competitive advantage. Okay? And if you think about it, the internet has increased the reach of firms. So firms that could only sell in their local market because they could only advertise in the local market. Okay? It was too costly to advertise, say, nationally or make yourself known nationally. All of a sudden, through the internet, can advertise and make themselves known and make their products and services available nationally. And then finally, IT has helped spawn IT businesses. So not just helped other businesses grow, but businesses around computing itself, obviously. Organizations or enterprises such as Oracle, IBM, Microsoft, these are all IT businesses, and they've essentially spawned, these are all new businesses spawned in the last, 20 years or so around information processing. One example of an IT business is something known as B2B integration. So a company like Sterling Commerce basically provides information linkages between companies. And that basically, just that integration is its business and is its product. This slide talks about where IT can be of most value given key trends in the business environment. The major business trend is the one towards globalization. Globalization essentially means the following. Thanks to technology being available everywhere, having been disseminated everywhere, this means that products can be manufactured anywhere with uniform quality. Essentially, a car made anywhere in the world is of the same quality. Thanks to cheap energy, there has been a removal of transportation barriers, which means that products that can be made anywhere can also be shipped anywhere. So you can buy a car that was made in China as easily as you might buy from the same lot that you might buy a car that is made in the US. Essentially, this has resulted in the outsourcing of product manufacturing, because manufacturing has gone to where things were cheapest in terms of labor costs. Also, overall, the world's population has moved up what is known as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Essentially, their basic needs have pretty much been met in most of the developed and the developing world. And so they're looking for things beyond just products. This means that services are now what firms must offer and what firms must compete on. Services have a physical component and an informational component, just like products do. And just like with products, IT can enable the informational part of the service. We'll now characterize services in an abstract manner, and then in the later slides try to understand in an abstract way or in a general way how information technology or computing can tackle each of these characterizations of services. The first is that with services, unlike products, there is high variation among the transactions, depending upon the particular situations and the skill of the service provider. The second thing is that there is continued negotiation between the customer and provider during service delivery. That is, what makes up the service is not known beforehand. It's typically customized in an interaction between the customer and the provider. Thirdly, with services, the proportion of fixed costs to variable costs in delivering the service is actually very low. Most of the costs are actually taken up by the variable costs. So there is a little opportunity to spread out large fixed costs across multiple transactions. In other words, there is very little economy of scale. Fourthly, satisfaction is not guaranteed even when the service might be repeated in an identical manner. You know, the acceptance of a service, the satisfaction with the service depends on many things beyond just the delivery of the service. There is a high requirement of a personal touch when a service is delivered. Also, decisions regarding who to get a service from or whether someone was satisfied by the service, etc. Many decisions are made on secondary factors, on things like opinion and trust and relationships. Finally, next, a service must be delivered at the point of need, that is where the customer is. And finally, local presence is an advantage. So if you're closer to a customer, you have a better chance to you have more of a chance to deliver a better service than someone who's far away. So now let's take each characteristic of service of a service and look at it in more detail. So let's take the first one around high variation among transactions. Okay, this basically means that when you provide the same service multiple times, each service transaction is different from each other service transaction. So going back to the example of an expensive restaurant, you might go to the same restaurant twice, but your service experience each time might be completely different. The first time you might enjoy it a lot, and the second time you might hate the whole visit. Okay, and the third time you might like it again, but maybe not so much. And there is also variation among experience depending upon the person who buys the service. So if I go, I might enjoy the service, but if you go, you might receive the service in an identical manner but not enjoy it at all, simply because your standards are different. Okay, so there is high variation among transactions. So now let's look at how an IT system might support or deal with high variation among transactions. Okay, so in addition to just simply implementing the transaction or implementing the order to cash transaction, in a service-oriented company, the IT system might need to collect feedback on the transaction once it's done. So there might be a little survey that might need to be presented to the customer to say, how did we do? Okay. Or it might, or the goal of that system might be to collect enough data to sort of eliminate all variation so that the service is delivered in a standardized manner and essentially becomes a product. So now you have a workflow system that needs to be implemented as part of your transaction system that keeps track of everything that was done in order to provide that service, measures how each of those different things were done, and collects enough data that somebody who analyzes it can then say, the reason for the variation in service quality was because this change in this step, and if we unify that step or make that step uniformly done by everybody, then there won't be as much variation in quality. You might think that this is not really practical, but a prototypical example of a service is a medical service. So when you go into a hospital, the doctor does not know what is wrong with you and has to sort of discover what is wrong with you and then treat you for it. But hospitals have found that by measuring every single patient and how he or she was treated, they're able to eliminate or understand the differences between the way these patients get treated by different doctors. They can correlate that with the satisfaction or the outcome of the treatment. And by creating standard ways by which particular diseases or symptoms are treated, they can improve the overall outcomes or the average of the overall outcomes. Okay. Essentially, what is happening is that services, by this kind of measurement, services can be converted into products. Okay. Now, the second characteristic of service is this continued negotiation during service delivery. So when you go to a fancy restaurant, coming back to that example, you might do things like, hey, I'd like my steak medium rare. My son always does this. He always asks for his bacon not crispy. I might ask for the dressing on the side. My wife might ask for butter on the side. You might say, I don't want, oh, I don't know, shellfish in my pasta. Can you substitute that with eggplant? Uh, um, the waiter might go back to the cook and find out that a certain ingredient is not available. Come back to you and say, I'm sorry, but the uh, the particular cut of steak that you asked for was not available, and so what would you prefer in exchange? So typically with services, there is this continued negotiation. Um, think about a medical service being offered. Doesn't the doctor keep asking you, how do you feel after he does one treatment versus the other? Okay, so how might a system support that? Well, you could think of adding to your enterprise system a social networking component, maybe a chat component, or some kind of feedback component or continuous feedback component that monitors how the customer is feeling and also allows the customer to modify the request while it's being processed. Okay. The third item is little cost amortization. So every product, every organization has fixed costs and labor costs, and the 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 proportion of labor costs to fixed costs in a service not only is high, but is consistently high. So the amount of labor involved in preparing a fancy meal doesn't decrease over time or cannot be amortized over multiple customers, but has to be expended for each customer. Okay. Um, so how might an IT system handle that? Well, one way might be to once again try to convert that service into a product and standardize that service. You can do it by providing better training, but essentially that's what you're doing is you're converting a service into a product. The fourth thing is this oscillation around satisfaction, and that's related to high variation among transactions. Okay, so you come in once, you don't like it, you come in the second time, you like it. Um, you like 80% of the service that was received, but one thing got screwed up in your service, and because of that, you hate the whole experience. Okay. You loved the food, but the dessert was burnt, or the bill was calculated incorrectly, or as you left, the restaurant owner didn't wave you goodbye, and from that point on, even though everything else was excellent, you just hated the whole experience. Okay, and the next thing is this high touch requirement. Um, Basically, the service provider has to be in constant communication with you in order to provide the service in a proper manner. The next thing is that decisions are made on secondary factors. So it's not based on the quality of the food or the quality of the meat, but really on the way you were treated, or an opinion about the restaurant that you read in a magazine that you trust, or the fact that you've been to the restaurant multiple times. Those are the things that determine the success of the service. The next thing is that a service, unlike a product, has to be delivered at the time of need. So if you're hungry, you need food right away. Okay, um, you can't be hungry and then get your food 24 hours later. Okay, and then finally, because of the fact that it has to be delivered at the point of need, local presence is an advantage. So it's very difficult to deliver a good service when you're far away. So remote medicine, even though it's considered feasible now, is not the best way to deliver medical services to a patient. Okay? So, for all these different characteristics, for a few of them, I gave you examples of what IT systems have to do. What I would like you to do now is for the ones I didn't give you examples, I need to think about what an IT system has to implement in order to support that characteristic of the service. In this slide, what I have done is taken all the examples across all the service characteristics and try to abstract them into a few categories. Okay, so essentially, computing or IT can help um, by assisting with the modeling of services, by the modeling of businesses. So imagine, if you will, an object-oriented model of your value chain. You can then create simulations around it. you can understand it. You can use all the computer science techniques for understanding software systems. You can apply that to the business. This concept was applied by IBM in a in a body of work known as the CBM, or the component business model. We won't go into the component business model in this class, but if you can, Google it. Essentially, what IBM did was created a prototypical model, a prototypical object-oriented model of each and every kind of business. So they had a component business model for insurance, a CBM for automotive companies, a CBM for fast food, a CBM for retail. And the idea was you had a object-oriented model that you could analyze, and then you could pick pieces of it and focus on those to optimize. So essentially, they were building businesses or improving businesses in the same way software engineers improve programs or large software systems. The second area where IT can help is in analysis. So once you have your data, once you have your model, you can write programs, you can write algorithms such as data mining algorithms to analyze how your business is doing, how your business is performing, and in order to suggest ways for improvement. The third way is essentially around automation. So you can take the business processes that exist within an organization, the way people do things in an organization, and automate them. Okay? Not only can you automate them, if you electronically enable these processes, you can then start measuring them, because everything will take place through an electronic system. So you can time how long things are taking, how many cycles there are in any operation, how much wait time there is, how much time is being wasted, things like that. And all of that helps you improve the process in a data-driven manner. Okay? The next way is IT can help essentially by systems monitoring and management. So all your IT systems and your human systems can use a technique known as autonomic computing for doing self-healing and optimization. You can do capacity planning. How big a system do you want? How big a computer system do you want? How big an organizational human system do you want? You can use computer programs to figure all of this out. You can also use computer programs, specifically resource allocation algorithms, to understand how to provision systems, which is how many resources and what kinds of resources operations in your system might take. And then finally, IT or computing can build computational models on how people and groups work and interact. Yeah. Where the knowledge or the theory behind how groups interact and so on came from other fields such as social science research. Okay? So the idea would be to take a soft research area such as social science research, which did not have a technical foundation, which did not in the past typically have a technical foundation. And now you have the capability through computing to have a computational foundation from which you can get, rather than soft human analysis kinds of decision making, you can actually do hard decision making based on real data. As an aside to our discussion regarding IT providing competitive advantage, Harvard professor Nicholas Carr took a position that IT is not a driver for competitive advantage within a company, but just a utility that needs to be managed for cost. Here are the arguments he made. He said that IT takes a long time to implement. IT initiatives are very costly to implement, but they are too easy to copy once they're implemented. Hence, there is no incentive for innovation by single companies. However, it is an enabler for economic value, but across businesses. Hence, IT must be provided by the government or by companies that are just like utilities. In fact, Dr. Carr is big on clouds and claims that clouds will be the only IT that is ever needed. So what do you think? Is this true? Two references for this lecture segment are listed here. Neither is required for the quiz. So now that we've talked about how IT can actually help, how IT can be applied to providing competitive advantage to a business, Let's talk about this notion of business IT alignment, which is how can IT provide help in the right way, in a way that it is aligned with and supportive of the needs of the business. Business IT alignment challenges can be placed into four categories. First, people challenges around the culture of the people in the different departments or organizations within the enterprise. Process challenges that arise from the complex nature of software development. Third, technical challenges around enterprise systems. These technical challenges are unique to enterprise systems, and we will cover them later in this lecture. Environmental challenges that arise from the business environment in which the system operates. Business IT alignment means that IT must try to deliver a sustainable competitive advantage to the business in a manner that is compatible with the business. This notion of compatibility or alignment will affect everything that we study in this course, starting with the technology down to the processes used to develop software, all of those things. Business IT alignment is really along three dimensions. One is the intellectual dimension, which is in all the planning and so on that takes place within an organization. The IT plans and the business plans must be compatible or must fit together. So there must be fit between the business strategy and the IT strategy. There must be linking between the business plan and the IT plan. There must be a fit between the business needs and the business priorities and the information system priorities. Secondly, there has to be a fit across the cultural dimension. That is, the communication and behavioral styles of the IT organization must fit with the communication and behavioral styles of the business. And finally, there must be fit across the structural dimension, which is the formal dimension of the organizational structure, the processes used, the way the project management is done, things like this. Finally, keep in mind that business IT alignment is a continuous process because the IT may be aligned with the business as it is today, but as the business evolves, the IT has to align with the business as it will be, tomorrow. So business IT alignment is a continuous process, and it's a continuous and ongoing process. So what did we cover in this lecture? We used Porter's model to understand how the structure of the industry segment of an enterprise determines the enterprise's business strategy. We used the value chain to understand how an enterprise can decide what business components or processes to focus on in order to improve its competitive position. We used the balance scorecard to describe how an enterprise can holistically translate its plans into actions. We looked at how information technology or computing can help, specifically in services. Finally, we discussed business IT alignment, which captures how IT organizations must work across multiple dimensions in order to integrate well with their enterprise or their business.